So I want to begin by saying, thank you for having me up here. It's truly an honor. I have been attending Pressnomics since the very first one, so this will be my sixth. So I briefly spoke in a lightning talk at the last Pressnomics, which was also amazing, but it'll be nice to have a full talk for you guys prepared. Great presentation ahead of us, so let's begin because I have a lot of content to cover and hopefully a lot of good information to share with you guys. I'm standing up here on stage in front of you guys today in order to talk to you about becoming agile. Hopefully it's something you guys are all involved in already. This is a software development lifecycle model that you guys hopefully have already begun to implement for yourselves in one way or another. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story, how we came to be operating under a Scrum Agile model, and tell you a little bit about the product trinity and how the roles in between the different parts of our organization work. And for those of you that don't operate in huge teams, how you can make this applicable to your teams as well. So a little bit about myself. I'm Seth Karstens. If you haven't met me before, hey. This is my family as well on the slides. You can see them here. We're one unit at this point, right? I'm at that point in my life where we are together, and we're a great family, and I could not do and dedicate myself to my career and do the things that I do without their support. So thanks to them, I'm up here talking to you guys about how we succeeded managing our processes with Agile. So let's overview what I'm going to cover today, and we're going to be pretty quick. Each of these, I've got a lot of slides to go over the amount of time that we have, and I've tried to cram all of this great content into this small 50-minute presentation. So I want to talk to you a little bit about my story first, right? And I also want to talk to you about how our story evolved into us using Agile and what decisions we made. And what we found after trying this out and iterating over it and making our team more efficient every couple of weeks. So let's just dive right in. So everybody's story is a journey. Anyone that's been working in the industry for a long amount of time would know that it's a process. You have to really endeavor and endure all the parts of your business or your division or managing your products, whatever that is. The easy journey isn't the one that's worth doing, right? It's the journey that's hard, where you've really accomplished something, where you've created value. Those are the journeys that are worth talking about, and those are the successes that you really remember and that you hold pride for. And this is one of mine. So this is just a great quote that I'd like to share with you, that there are no secrets to success. It is a result of preparation, hard work, and learning from failure. That was by Colin Powell. And what it really accentuates here is that there is no secret to this, right? Like, the people that are the most successful are usually very well planned hard workers. And we fail. Like, the best of us, we fail and we learn from it and we get back up and we do better. So with that in mind, let's start talking about my story and how it started. As most stories do, we started with a last in, first out approach to our project management. And that's where, as you can see here, the last thing that we discuss or talk about doing is the first thing that we expect to be finished, right? So I walk out of my office and I stop by, Dave's desk over here, and I'm like, Dave, dude, we've got to solve this problem. Check this out. I think I've got a workable solution. Maybe you can bang something out for me. Not a really great approach long term. It definitely works sometimes for when you're trying to create a proof of concept or a minimum viable product, or you're trying to get a small team to operate off the ground without much infrastructure. It's just a model that we kind of take, right? Is we just create a set of tasks and we try and tackle them every day. But it doesn't create a very good, great software development lifecycle model, and it's not very scalable. So the next thing that you kind of wander into is people start like throwing words at you, like Gantt charts and waterfall, and they want you to start using applications to track what you're doing, and that's all good and fine, and those are helpful tools. But eventually you figure out that like waterfall isn't as good as this new thing that's out called agile, or agile, depending on your interpretation of the word and how you say it. But here we kind of demonstrate the difference between waterfall and agile, and how the agile model really creates less risk, which is really what we're looking for as engineering managers. And so you can see here that by releasing more frequently, you can reduce the amount of risk with each release, and you can also create additional value ahead of time. The waterfall model typically has a longer release cycle, and as such, you don't get the value until the very end. So here's something else that we learned along the way, right? Is that it was great, and we had all these ideas about moving to these new models and using some new project management techniques. But if you don't start your change with leadership and leaders changing first, and you just ask everyone else to make the changes, and you expect your entire team to operate differently, and it doesn't work, right? And you expect these great results, but you keep interrupting your people, or you think you're outside of the rules because you're the boss or you're the manager or whatever, and you don't necessarily operate by the rules that you're asking the rest of your team. That really creates a problem, and you don't get very good results from that. So I would always recommend that we start the change at the leadership level. This is a pretty popular comic. I've seen it a few times. I wanted to bring this up, that if you are constantly interrupting people during their time of focus, it really breaks their stride. And we want to avoid that. And part of the agile models that we're going to talk about really help identify areas of focus time for people and areas of when they're supposed to be in meetings and discussing things. Come on. There we go. All right. So what we really want to do is we found that it was better to redirect our focus to leadership change initiatives. Once all the leaders bought into the new process and agreed that this is how we were going to do things, then we pushed a prescriptive model that evolved slowly over time. And I think this is a really important part too, is as you're reading blog articles or Twitter links or whatever that might be, and you're trying to find the model that fits your team, or maybe you're considering changing models, is that if you don't already have a model that works today, find a prescribed model and follow it to the T for a little while and then change it. Don't think that you're already going to outsmart the model and create something completely custom the first go around. We kind of tried that in a few different places, and it just never really worked. Now that we took a very prescriptive model and now we've made changes to it so it's not exactly as it was originally prescribed as Scrum, but it worked much better when we endured and kind of just went through the motions of the prescribed model first and then found ways that our team could be more efficient over time. So let's talk, so that's kind of our evolution into, in our processes and how we moved into using Agile and Scrum very specifically, which is what I'm going to be talking about. So let's talk a little bit about what that looks like. What is Agile? What is Scrum? Seth, what are we supposed to do with this? Or we already use Agile, but maybe Seth, you have some tips and tricks. I do. I have those tips and tricks for you. Let's talk about them. First though, let's baseline, because I don't know everyone in the room's understanding of where we're at, what you guys use right now. So let's just stop for a moment and define Agile. Agile is a time-boxed, iterative approach to software delivery that builds software incrementally from the start of the project instead of trying to deliver it all at once at the end. So if you think back to the diagram that I showed you about a comparison of waterfall and agile approach, it really tries to delineate itself as a waterfall-like model, but with this separation of how it iterates more quickly. This is a great example and diagram to kind of show you a great picture of the difference between the waterfall process and the agile process, and why the agile process is so much better. And while this is just a metaphor, it really does apply like this in real life, right? Is that it's really tough and it's really risky to take this big thing with you and try and drag it across the finish line. Instead of the agile process, which creates bite-sized chunks that are perfectly good to go individually, and then when you get to the end, you have this big, robust product that you're ready to deliver. So just a great example of that. So I'm going to give you a moment to watch this. Every good presentation that I've seen has some sort of funny GIF or animated thing, and I just couldn't make mine without putting one in there. I'm not going to leave this up for too long because you can just get drawn in, and I'm sure you're not listening to anything that I'm saying right now. But the point of this slide is just to show that if you just see Agile as fast, you're going to fail. Agile isn't just about being fast. It's about creating bite-sized chunks or small iterative changes. So Seth, out of the agile processes, what process should we be using? Well, that really depends. Every team is different. Every team operates a little different. You have different products and ways that you have to deliver those things and different stakeholders. But generally speaking, most people use Scrum. That's probably, if you've heard of an agile process, everybody knows about Scrum because it's used the most. Now, there are other processes out there, and some of them are displayed on the screen right now, and maybe those are the best for your team. But if you're trying to move from an older process to an agile process, I would highly recommend that you stay within the confines and prescribe Scrum activities that we're going to go over today. So my opinion on choosing a process, and I'm not going to go through all of the pros and cons of this slide just because we don't have enough time really, but let me just touch on a few things, okay? Kanban is really great, just like it says here, for continuous improvement and a very flexible process. And so this will kind of depend on how you have to communicate with your stakeholders. If you want to communicate with your stakeholders kind of as you're releasing or after you're releasing things, and you release things very frequently, then I might recommend that you try starting with a Kanban process. If you are releasing things a little bit longer scheduled and you have to spend a lot of time communicating to your stakeholders exactly what's going to go into each release, maybe even well in advance of the release, Scrum operates in a much more, what's the right word for it, transparent schedule, right? It's a lot more structured, and that structure gives you the ability to kind of be more prepared ahead of time to communicate those things with your stakeholders, to really let them understand what you're doing. And if you have more questions about differences in these, Kanban or Scrumban or any hybrid or any of those things, feel free to find me afterwards, and I'll be happy to speak with you about those. So like I said before, I would really prescribe you, and they're called prescriptions, right? Because part of the deal with Scrum and getting involved in it is that you really have to follow the prescription to get the outcomes that it promises, right? Scrum promises you certain features, if you will, of its product, and those features can only be guaranteed if you use it to its fullest extent by following all the rules, doing all of the ceremonies, and really committing yourself to it. Not unlike a real prescription, if you don't follow all of the directions, adverse side effects can happen. So this is where I want to really ream you in, because some people have checked out because they have certain preconceptions about what I'm talking about, or about Scrum itself, or about these agile processes, or the ceremonies and meetings, that maybe this is just way too much for me. I don't need all of this. Let me give you some really great feedback about who this presentation is for and who can take it and use it. So something that you might be thinking is, I'm not big enough to use these processes. Yes, you are. I have used these processes in much smaller portions, in a team of two, just building some fun stuff on the side with my peers. Maybe the processes take too long and we don't have time. Like, Seth, you don't understand. We are busy people. Trust me, I know busy. And I'm telling you right now, by using these processes, you'll actually be more efficient. It'll let you get more done. Another thing that you might be thinking is, like, we move way too fast for Scrum. I'm telling you right now, it's just not possible. You can't move too fast to use an efficient process. These processes are built to make your time the most valuable time for building software and with engineers. So just keep those things in mind. Some things that I have on the top here, the right things to think about is that compartmentalizing the process depending on your team sizes. Like, consider what I'm saying and how big your teams are, and we're gonna have some like do's and don'ts depending on your team size. Reduce ceremony time depending on your team size. If Scrum prescribes 15 minutes for stand-ups and you've got 3 people, you probably don't need 15 minutes. So, use the prescription, apply the prescription for you, so that if you don't need all of these things in the same sizes that they're prescribed, scale back a little bit. And this last one, everybody seems to like it, but you have to stop thinking about your engineers like fast food service workers. You don't come up to an engineer and you stand at his desk and then you order something and then you expect it back. Applying some planning and process and having a way that you handle priorities, it doesn't just benefit your business, it benefits your engineers, their schedule, and their mental health. All right, so moving on into describing product tips and tricks. Seth, what have you learned over time? I'm about to tell you. So product is the what and the why, okay, of whatever you're making. And some of these things don't just apply to engineering. They can apply to other businesses. Obviously, we're going to focus on engineering teams and software development, but I just want to throw out there that we're not the only ones out there using these models. So product is the what and the why, and let's discuss a little bit about what that means. I'm going to show you this product trinity visual multiple times because it really describes the relationships between these 3 divisions of role in your business or your software development lifecycle. And I really want you to not think of them as people, and I want you to think of them as roles. That's really important because, for example, if you have a team of 3 that's getting a piece of software off the ground, and you have a startup company and you're working out of the basement and you've got 2 desks from IKEA butted up next to each other and that's how you guys are working, you can still use all the techniques that I'm going to talk about today. It's just that people will have to play multiple roles, or you will have to segment out parts of your day to operate in each of these roles. So with that said, let's begin. So there's 2 relationships that product has, right? Product has a relationship with engineering, and product has a relationship with product. And let's talk about how those are different. Product and project, they really interact with the stakeholders the most. And so everything's going to really start with product because that's what you're making. So they're going to determine what you're making, and they're going to determine that by business priorities and what's good for the business, and that's usually the why. They're going to do some sort of analysis to determine why they're doing what they're doing, and that describes what you're producing. And then they're going to be working with project in order to align, when some of that stuff goes out. So let's dive right in and talk about what the POs do, or the product owners. Okay, they're typically ticket movers. They are a priority controller. They really control the priority of what's being worked on, because there's a lot of stuff that would be very valuable to your software product, no doubt. But some things are more valuable than others. And making sure that you're working on the most valuable stuff first will increase, the value of your product to the end consumer. So they're also, they have a very high role in stakeholder communication, to explain the what and the why that we're building to them as well, and sometimes to onboard them, answer questions, or facilitate bugs in the process, or whatever that might be. The PO role typically also has some QA responsibilities, whether they do it themselves or they manage a team that does that. They have responsibilities usually built around KPIs. They're usually held accountable for how the business is doing because they manage the products. They're extremely critical, and let me just back up. All of the Scrum meetings are important, okay? If you can get every team member to always attend every single meeting, that would be exceptional. But I am going to talk about some of the meetings where the rules are less important to absolutely have. So if somebody's on vacation and they're a product owner, like missing a planning meeting might be fine because someone from project is probably going to make sure that planning meeting goes okay. So with that said, the PO role is really critical to be in grooming meetings. It's really important for them to be at most stand-ups to understand where their product is at and if they're on schedule or not, and retros so that they can engage in what we can change in order to make the process better. So nerds in the room will know where this came from, this animation came from, but it really applies to the product owner's role. Is you really have to commit to the process and you have to stick to it, or it's probably not going to work. You're going to fall short somewhere, you're going to miss something. These processes were really built for product people, with product people in mind. So if you work in product, or if that's one of your roles in the business, I highly encourage you, to take heart to the things that we're going to talk about doing today. Failing to commit to really the entire process here is going to lead to confusion in the rest of the team and the other divisions. You're going to have communication issues with exactly who should be saying what, or you're going to have too many meetings or not enough. So that's my fair warning to you. Let's talk a little bit about task sizes, because this is another kind of tip that I can throw at the product ownership role, is that task sizes are really important. We make it our goal to make most of our tickets 3s and 5s, and we'll talk about ticket size a little bit more when we get to project. But think about Goldilocks and the Three Bears, right? Goldilocks goes in and she tries all the porridges, and one of them is just right, and we need to create tasks that our engineers can work on in the same way. So let's follow these two rules. Tasks should always be small enough to make progress in a single sitting. You don't want tasks that feel like they're going to take forever. The task shouldn't be this one big thing that's going to take you 3 months to build. You want bite-sized chunks, or Agile isn't going to work for you. And then number 2 is that tasks should always be big enough not to be interruptive when you move between related tasks. So you don't want 50 one-line code change tickets, just as an example. Now, maybe 50 one-line code tickets is actually what you do need for your team. Typically, though, I would imagine that would be pretty interruptive, unless these are like bug fixes or something simple. If you're trying to create a product that way, then you're probably getting in your own way. So try to just take this with you as a piece of information when we get to the project section and we talk about sizing our tasks or issues. Just keep this in mind. Always shoot for 3s and 5s. The last thing that I kind of wanted to give you as a part of my product tips and tricks is just like the life of a work item. For those of you that are deeply involved in project planning and product management, this should look very familiar to you. But again, I kind of want to make sure that everyone is baselined on, I don't know what everyone's knowledge in the room is, and I want to make sure that we take a look at the structure of a task or ticket, because all of the parts that I've highlighted here are really critical to the Agile process. So one, we start at the top. Every ticket's got a title, right? It needs to be brief, to the point, and we use this like piping mechanism where it's easier to find things that you're searching for, where we put general category on the left, which is arc or architecture, a pipe, and then a description. And you can break it up multiple times if you want to, depending on how many tasks you have and how divisive you want to be. And then the second thing is you always want to book your tasks into an epic, which can just be thought of as a feature. Once you get into actually linking to features as well, you might find yourself that your product is big enough that you have epics and then you have features as well. But let's just keep it simple for now. Let's just say we've got our title. We're going to take this ticket and we're going to book it into an epic. And then when all of the tasks inside of that epic are done, that feature is officially on full release. The third thing, and these are in order of kind of when they're created. That's what I tried to do here. The third and fourth things are basically like the description of what the person needs to do. So you're going to have two things. You're going to have acceptance criteria and user stories. Actually, not in that order. You're going to have user stories first and then acceptance criteria. So the user stories are going to explain to the engineer and anyone else that might be reading this ticket and following along with it what the story about what somebody might do and how it should work when it's done. And then acceptance criteria is a more detailed list of what might need to be changed, added, or enhanced in order to produce the results of the user story. So after you have those things, then we're going to move on to story points, and that's where we go through, determining the size of the ticket. Again, we're going to touch that when we get into project management here in just a minute. After that, you have to assign it to a sprint or a backlog if it's not ready to be assigned out into a particular time. The backlog is typically where things sit in the queue until they're ready to be prioritized and then moved into an actual timing. And we call those timings sprints. The last two things here is that you would then plan this ticket out and somebody would pick it up and do it. We typically do that during our planning ceremonies in Scrum. So you can see here it's assigned to me. And then lastly, as I do work on the ticket, I log my time. And I know that's probably the last thing everybody likes to do in their day is log time and hours. But we're going to talk about how that's actually a pretty critical part of managing your process and becoming more efficient. Just a few more, pointers that I wanted to point out and talk about is if you're working in the product role, make sure you have a clear intake process and that it's fairly simple and straightforward to use. Always use epics and labels for reporting purposes. So if your project management software that you use allows you to use epics for grouping and it allows you to label or tag things, use those things. Think about how they make sense for you and your team. Always have a per sprint focus. That was really helpful when we started doing that. It kind of gets engineers and the people actually doing the work into a really good mind state so that they have an idea and a direction that they're going, and they'll do better work. The per sprint focus, as narrow as possible. Sometimes you can't always have a really narrow focus in every sprint, and sometimes you can, and just know that when you can get a narrow focus, you guys will probably be more productive. And then run new product kickoff meetings. Engineers really benefit from knowing the what and the why the product does. Again, they're not fast food workers. Treat them like people that are interested in your product because they probably are. That's why they're building it with you. So number 4. So we're finally out of product. We're moving into project. Going to do a time check. It looks like we're at about 28 minutes. Got about 15 minutes left. Just want to make sure we're on track here so that I can get everything out there to you. All right, so project. This is let me go back. This is the who and the when part of the part of your product life cycle. And in case I didn't make it clear earlier, this is kind of following the W's, right? Is the who, what, when, where, why. We're trying to solve all of those with roles in the product trinity. So now we're in project and they're going to solve the who and the when, just like it shows you here in the background. It's the runner and he's being timed, so he knows exactly where he's at in the process and that he's assigned to run this route. We're going to talk about how that applies to our product trinity here. So project interacts, of course, with product and engineering. And so how they interact with product engineering is that they determine the priorities with the stakeholders and with product. And so there's a lot of communication on those two things about the who and the when. And the who is typically, who from engineering is going to build that thing. And then we also have product and engineering, and those two kind of coordinate that release down there at the bottom that you can see. Now you're saying, Seth, stakeholders are pretty far away from the engineers. Is that intentional? Yes, that's pretty intentional. We've found it to be very beneficial that project and product role people typically interface the best with stakeholders, and that engineers can get bogged down into confusion of priority when they're directly involved in the stakeholders. Your team might not be big enough. Your engineers may have to interact with the stakeholders. Just know that if you can limit exactly which engineers interact with the stakeholders, so that the engineers with the most product experience can be interacting with them, that's really gonna help the communication and maybe drive down some of the what's the right word, the crossfire, the banter, right? The like interruptiveness that has, right? The stakeholders have their view of what's best for the business, but that's just their view. The product role is to really determine what's truly valuable for the business and not just what we feel emotional about or want. So hopefully we can drive that out, and product can really define those things and help protect the engineers to be working on the things that are most valuable for your business. So I have a racing theme, in case you didn't know. Running, racing, that's what we have going on here. Thought it went well with the sprint concept, so you'll see that theme throughout my slides. Scrum teams, though, let's use a metaphor. Scrum teams are like relay teams. The better you plan and practice together, the more likely you are to succeed. And so if you can imagine for yourself for a second, like you're on a relay team and you guys have never practiced together, and it's just 4 random people. The first time that you go out is probably going to be pretty rough, but the more that you talk to each other about the parts of that didn't work right and things you're going to do different next time, that really is the same way that Scrum is going to work. So let's talk about the product manager role responsibilities. They're typically the ticket movers. They move the tickets throughout the sprint, or enforce that the people that are assigned to the tickets move the tickets into the appropriate spot. But I consider part of their responsibilities is they're supposed to make sure the tickets are in all the right swim lanes. And the swim lanes are just the different pieces, the different parts of the project between to do and done. They're also responsible for planning and hours. So planning is the process where we actually assign out work that is to be done during the next sprint. Our sprints are 2 weeks, so if you hear me say that, then you just know that sprints, 2 weeks of work, that's about the same thing for us. And hours is also like capacity. You can think about it that way, because if you operate on capacity by points, perfectly fine if you can make that work. But generally speaking, they're responsible for those things. They're responsible for the when, right? And that's what that is. Stakeholder communication. So they're partnered with the project or product role, and that they're responsible for some of, or maybe sometimes all of, the stakeholder communication, communicating when things are going to go out and why they're going out at that time. They have some KPI responsibilities around, deliverable timings and understanding and relaying the risk of those things that aren't going to be delivered on time. So they're really critical for the planning and project management parts of the business. Again, I'm going to go through. They're critical for the grooming meetings. They're pretty critical to all of the meetings. I mean, it's the project management role, right? But again, so like stand-ups and retros are important, but other people could lead those as long as they take on all the responsibilities of the project manager's documentation of those things. And then they're pretty critical for plannings as well. I have a typo in the slide there I'll have to fix, but they're critical for plannings, and they're actually optional for the groomings. Plannings is the when, and the groomings is the what. So kind of got those switched up with the product ownership role, but I'll get that corrected. The project manager can also be the Scrum Master. I'm not going to read this out for you, exactly what a Scrum Master is, but basically a Scrum Master is just somebody that helps you understand Scrum and makes sure that your team is on course to obey all the prescribed ceremonies and activities and how you do them. You don't really need a Scrum Master. In fact, if you really dive in and read what a Scrum Master is supposed to do, they're supposed to put themselves out of a job if that's their job. So I would imagine most Scrum Masters or people that call themselves that probably operate in a way that they're contracted in, or that they don't have a long-term life cycle or part of that business, because their job is really just to make sure that the team can operate in Scrum by themselves. And at some point, they won't need the Scrum Master to guide them anymore. They'll understand how to do it on their own. That said, project manager usually owns some of those tasks and responsibilities if the team strays too far off of what they agreed to do, because it doesn't necessarily have to be exactly what's prescribed. It's just what the team agrees to do over time. This person, though, has to be firm and authoritative. And if they're not both of those things in nature, or skilled and taught and trained how to be those things, and they're also, you have to, leadership needs to empower them to be authoritative as well. But if those things happen, then you'll have somebody who's very good at what they're doing, and they'll really be able to help you through guiding your team through the Scrum process. Team size is really important. Again, I'm not going to go into huge amounts of detail here. There's a lot of information in this slide, but I just want to give you the tip that, really reconsider large groups of people that are working on the same thing. If you have a team of 9, but each person is really owning their own project, that's fine. You can be one big team. But if you truly have a team that's working on the same thing, same kind of code or modules or plugins, or they're all working on the same plugin, even if it's slightly different parts, there's probably going to be some interactivity that's going to happen there. And there's going to be some people that step on each other's toes or work on some of the same things. Maybe you have 2 people that actually build the same feature in 2 different plugins, whatever that might be. Keep your team sizes smaller when they're really interacting like that across the same product. It creates more scalable architecture in case you need to grow rapidly later, which is really going to help you if you have a huge growth phase and your business really takes off. Don't ignore this though. If you have improper team sizes, you really need to make an adjustment now, as soon as you can. Let's go over a sprint. So this is a sprint, sorry. This is a Scrum sprint. It's over 2 weeks. Maybe yours is 1 week, maybe it's 3 weeks. Ours is 2 weeks, and I'm just going to give you like an example of what ours looks like. I'm not going to go into detail of each day, and you can get these slides afterwards, so you're welcome to check.
It's 20 hours.
Day to day exactly what we're doing. But I wanted just to give you guys like a boilerplate, right, if you're trying to get started. And we're going to circle back to a few things about this after we talk about the ceremonies. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about each ceremony for those of you that are a little newer to Scrum, and why these ceremonies are important. So the first ceremony is stand-up. Stand-up is where each of your engineers kind of stands up and gives a brief description of what they did yesterday, what they're planning on doing today, and if there's any blockers to the work that they're doing. Blockers would be something that would prohibit them from completing their task either at all or by the end of the sprint. The next ceremony that I want to talk about is called grooming, which they've renamed to refinement. You want to know why? Again, find me afterwards. I'll be happy to talk to you more about what happened there with Scrum, but I'm going to call it grooming because that's what I've always called it. So backlog grooming is used to basically determine the size of each task or ticket, and it's done between somebody from product that's describing the requirements of the ticket and the relationship between product and engineering. And engineering are the ones that are thinking like, how are we going to do this? How long do we think that's going to take? And we use something called the Fibonacci sequence to estimate size. So here you can see what a small rock would look like. Everybody knows like, okay, that's a small rock. 3 points, we're going to go with a medium, and 5 points, we've got a large rock. And while it can be really challenging to estimate things in engineering, especially when you're talking about things like bugs, we can at least generally get an idea as to, these 10 tickets that I thought about from the past were all mediums, and this seems like about that same size, so we're going to point it as a 3. So how do you do that? What's a really good way? I don't have that slide until we get into engineering. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about really good ways that you can, and a tool that you can use that's really going to help you with estimating the size of your tasks. Time tracking. It's been really critical for us. Some engineering groups can do without it, and they can really just use story points, but we've found it incredibly valuable to be able to use hours for now. And again, it's an iterative process. Maybe a year from now, we'll figure out how to make points work so that we can truly gain the advantage of estimation using the Fibonacci estimation sequence. So this is just an example of our time tracking sheet. Again, boilerplate for you. Just wanted to give you something that we work from. So the lead, let me just call it a few things, is that the lead has more reserved days in that like second to last column there, because the lead typically spends more time in plannings and architecture meetings and pull request reviews, things outside of the scope of a ticket, whereas the other engineers have less amounts of those things, so they have higher development capacity, and you'll kind of see that throughout the slide here. Again, if you'll be able to get these slides afterwards, so if you want to take a more detailed look at this chart, you can. So planning. Planning is really an easy, sometimes it can be daunting, and especially as you're getting your team acquainted with the new process, it'll feel like a very clumsy part. But over time, you'll get better at it, and it actually will become a very simple part of your process. And it's really just the assignment of work. Or depending on how your team operates, this can actually be where engineers choose the work that they do. So they can opt into things that they're interested in, parts of the project that they feel like they're the best and most adequately skilled at developing. So some tips there is to, again, always start with a focus. When talk about the focus of your sprint before you start your planning, so that the engineers enter into a state of mind where they really understand what's being created or what features that you're going to be building this sprint before they start picking up these tickets. Always start with the rollover hours, because you need every engineer thinking like, oh gosh, I still got 5 hours to complete from the tasks that we didn't quite finish up in the last sprint, so I better not pick up as many tickets as I did the last time around when I had a full schedule to fill. Don't allow people to regroom the tickets in planning. This happens to us a lot, where engineers want to rehash out like, oh, was that a good solution that we talked about in grooming? If those things happen, talk about them in the retro so that you can correct it ahead of time and start actually taking care of those things in the grooming. And that everyone understands that like when grooming's over, like that was your time that you had to talk about those things. And don't architect solutions during planning either. The person who picks up the ticket is probably, hopefully you hired them because they're smart enough to do some investigative research on their own to determine what the best solution is. And if they're not, hopefully you found somebody who isn't afraid to ask questions and is going to pick the brain of a more senior member of the team until they have an adequate solution. So don't feel like you have to architect solutions to each of your tickets ahead of time. So project has a few other ceremonies. I'm not going to go into great detail, but these are all awesome parts of our sprint, and I would highly encourage you to look into each of these. And if you're interested in what we do for any of these other ceremonies, again, feel free to find me afterwards or ask some questions about them. I'm happy to talk to you about them. So back to the 2-week sprint schedule is that some important things to note is that we have QA and code freeze, and that may be just a part of our process. It may or may not apply to you. You may not need to code freeze, depending on exactly how you QA your work and what you have to deliver and what your stakeholders expect. The exact timing of the ceremonies is flexible, so if you don't need an hour for grooming, don't take an hour. If you don't need an hour for planning, don't take an hour. Consider those things to be fairly flexible, but try to start with the prescribed times that Scrum has for you. Oftentimes product will need to schedule additional grooming meetings, especially if you weren't agile before and you're trying to, evolve into it now. It's going to take product some time to catch up, because when you enter the agile scrum model, you're really supposed to be 3 or 4 sprints ahead, and it's going to take them some time in order to groom enough tickets that they can really plan 3 or 4 sprints ahead. So be patient and flexible with them as you transition into this if you're not already doing these things. Engineering. All right, I'm not going to spend a ton of time in this section because you all are probably pros at managing engineers. But I may have a couple of things that you haven't thought about yet, or some tips and tricks that I can share with you, at least as it applies to the engineering process, or how engineering is managed within the product trinity. So going to circle back to this one more time, right, is that engineering is the one on the right side of your diagram here. It is, they interact, of course, with product on, what we're building, and they're managing, and they're interacting with project on, when we're building what we're building. And then, of course, they're working very closely together with project on exactly when releases go out. Again, in a Scrum model where you release maybe once every week or once every 2 weeks or whatever that looks like. All right, so let's move into this. So this is a really great quote from Steve Jobs. Design is not just what it looks like and just what it feels like. Design is how it works. And the engineers really build how it works. So let's dive into the engineering role. These are the ticket workers. They're the ones typically doing the actual work inside of the tickets. Now, some tickets may not be assigned to engineers, but generally speaking, if you have a technology project, especially in the WordPress world, most of your ticket workers are going to be engineers, or they're going to be following the engineer role while they're working on the ticket. So maybe you have somebody that's a product person and an engineer, or they have both of those roles as part of their job. Totally fine. When they're doing the engineer role, they'll probably be doing most of these things. They're going to be planning. They're going to be in planning in hours, right? So they're going to have to be estimating and thinking about how many hours they have versus how many tickets they can pick up. They're also going to be in the project and product communications meetings, right? So status updates of what's being done. They're going to be expected to describe, a status of where they're at throughout the sprint. They're probably going to have code review responsibilities of other team members. So that's kind of outside of the scope of tickets, right? So you're going to have to consider time that's not just assigned in a ticket or a task. And then they're going to have probably some of their own QA responsibilities, like make sure this works in the scope of the ticket before you hand it off to product or somebody else to, double check and confirm that their work is good. And they're basically critical for all meetings. If any of your engineers miss really any of the Scrum meetings, they're going to be missing out on something, and it'll be very apparent at the end of the sprint. So your engineers are pretty critical for this. Be careful with letting them skip out on any of those ceremonies. Some tips and tricks for engineers. As a leader, you have to encourage and sometimes even enforce face-to-face time. I found that it's very beneficial to to see the nonverbal communications of your engineers when they're shaking their head no, or sighing, or big thumbs up, or excited about something. That nonverbal communication is important, and you're missing out on it if all of your meetings are just over Slack, or they're just a call or a phone call. Planning poker. So I promised you a tool that would help you size and estimate things as an engineering team, and let me tell you, planning poker is awesome. And there's a free software out there if you're not ready to jump into something that costs money. Totally okay. Firepoker.io will give you a similar experience to planning poker, but the gist is that we're going to have a task that's in front of us, and we're going to remove estimation bias, where somebody says, oh, that's a 5, and everyone goes, yeah, that's a 5. Instead, everyone is going to have their own private vote, which is then revealed after everyone has voted on the sides of the ticket, and then you'll have a little bit of time, because that'll usually cause some people to discuss discrepancies in what they voted here. Please don't ever vote only 8s, 5s, and 13s. As what's showed on the screen, the 13s would be a bad size ticket, as we discussed earlier in the product. section. So just a few more things on engineering. Cross-team and engineering demos, really big plus win for us. If you've got multiple teams operating, this is a big win to have demos across the teams, because the teams like to know what the other teams are working on, and sometimes there's collaboration that can go on things that have synergies. Two more things to think about is, like, the developers don't have a 40-hour coding work week. 20% of their time should really be dedicated to documenting decision logs and architecture reviews. Architecture reviews is usually like one big thing that happens within a sprint on larger features, but just keep that in mind, that you need to dedicate some time for that. And also tech debt. Tech debt is something that I talk a lot about product. Because it's tough for product to see that as incredibly valuable. But the problem with tech debt is that the longer that it's outstanding, the more debt that you accrue over time. So you really don't want to let that crop up for too long. If you want to talk to me more about tech debt, I'll be available afterwards. Running out of time here, so we're just going to keep on moving through. We made it to the end. What's the takeaway? What are you really gonna? If you ignored me for the last 15 minutes, what tips can I leave you with that you can leave the room with? So I came up with this, right? Like, this is what my presentation is about. This is what I'm trying to tell you. We use process in order to reduce chaos, encourage collaboration, and establish a known level of entry. Now, I know I'm already over time, but let me just say that again. We use process in order to reduce chaos, encourage collaboration, and establish a known level of entry. So this helps us in a multitude of ways by establishing a process for our teams. The known level of entry, that just means, like, when you're onboarding somebody new, do they have a good experience? Is it easy to make sure that you're giving them everything? Can you scale your team and grow rapidly because of the processes that you have? If not, you may want to take some time to build on some of the tools that I've given you today. I'm going to leave you with this chart one last time. This is the product trinity. Really critical to break out these roles, have them assigned, make sure everyone understands what those roles are and who will be doing them. And then just my review, right? Like, I gave you my story that that we moved from this LIFO model into a more like Gantt chart waterfall, and then we eventually evolved into Agile, and that's where we stay today, and I find it to be very successful. Now, and then we talked a little bit about what that meant, right? We talked about Agile and how it's very prescribed. We talked about the product trinity and how each of those parts of the trinity constitutes the whole product process. And I talked a little bit about intentionality. If you read between the lines, and that intentionally make these changes small and over time. Establish how much transparency you need, and agree on how much process you need to accommodate. So what I mean by that is just what I had said earlier, which is that if you've only got 3 members on your engineering team, don't take 15 minutes for stand up, just take 5 minutes for stand up. We then covered each of the parts of the Trinity: product, project, and engineering. And I gave you some tips and tricks in each one of these, for product, to make sure that you really commit to the process. When you're working in the project management role, that accountability is really important. And lastly, that, in engineering, encourage well-roundedness and give the engineers time to, really focus on everything: tech writing, demos, training, speaking. Those things make an engineer more well-rounded, and they'll eventually make your team much better at what they do, and you'll have a better product because of it. And lastly, I just want to leave you with iterate. Always make smaller changes. The whole point of what we've learned today is that Agile is about breaking away big risky things and making changes in a small, much more bite-sized way that you can take with you. So thank you very much. Sorry again, I'm over time, but I hope you enjoyed the tips and tricks that I had in my story, and maybe you've taken away something that'll help you develop a better process for yourselves. Thanks, and have a great day. If you want to find these slides, you can find them in the top right corner. There's a link to them. You can jot that down or take a snapshot of the slide, or whatever you need to do. If you have any questions and you want to contact me directly, here's my personal information as well. Have a good day.